Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you, Academy, for honoring me by becoming a thinker of this year. I will, in my presentation, which is based upon 2 chapters in the report that Professor Modoud and I made, I will deal with something much more mundane, and that is social problems, and more specifically, delinquency amongst immigrant youth and the problem of terrorism. I shall try to show that these subjects can be fruitfully studied and how possible policy solutions may follow a particular line of thinking in multiculturalist theory, although it differs quite much from what you have heard today. I would like to start with the outcome. That is to say, how does the fact that 20% of the Flemish population is from minority background, how is it possible that on a day as today we are here, all interested in this particular subject, that a much smaller portion of our audience is coming from visible minorities? I think something has gone wrong, because most of the large immigrations have already started more than 50 years ago, and you still are in this situation. I have tried to describe that in section 1 of my report, and I will not at length discuss it, but it's only to make you understand why I selected for my subjects specifically Moroccan Turkish backgrounds, people of the 2nd and 3rd generation. There are groups sufficiently large to study, and both groups, that's the point, suffer from serious social disadvantages, and I have tried to find facts on these two kinds of integration that are often distinguished in conventional immigration theory. In the case of Belgium or Flanders, that is socio-economic integration and cultural integration. Now, the type of reasoning in my section on delinquency and terrorism is as follows. I discuss the irregularities in crime immigration theory as it stands now. Then I look what we know about it in Belgium. Then to what practical problems does it lead? So, for example, what do Belgians do with new types of criminality, such as honor killings or female excision? Or what do the nefast, I like that word that you often use in Flemish, the nefast policy minority relations? What do we know about the effectiveness in practice of ways to solve these kind of problems? Okay, in my simplest theory behind it, I start with the outcome, I said, and I start by behavior rather than by attitude. This means that I would like to change the situation by inviting people on positions of power to make social upward mobility possible, in the hope, and there is plenty of social psychology research that supports this hope, in the hope that this will change the attitudes of society at large. This rather than the other way around. Now let me start with one particular problem to explain, to show you how this works. During my fact-finding months, it has become my impression that there are almost no magistrates in Flanders in the administration of criminal justice that have a Moroccan or a Turkish migration background. Now, if I ask how many are there, I get the usual answer, we don't have figures on that. No, specifically, we don't collect figures on that. That was also part of the problem of the first chapter that I wrote, that there is so little empirical material to write about. Okay, so they can't be counted. But in this case, the number of magistrates, that's not very difficult. I found a chief prosecutor in Flanders, and he told me offhand that there are 2 of them. There's not much counting that you need. 2, that's all. And we are having a 3rd generation of Moroccans and Turks in this country. It would help the criminal law process, we think, if there would be more of them. It would take away the idea that only white magistrates are judging immigrant suspects. It would familiarize judges and prosecutors with the idea of Moroccan colleagues instead of only Moroccans being defendants. Moroccan or Turkish magistrates would function maybe as a role model or figures to identify with for minority youth. There is consistent evidence that there is discrimination in the punishment administered by judges. You can do something against that. Now, the first question then is, why are there so few magistrates? Well, the obvious first answer is, there are only very few minority students who take this law as a subject. Is that true? I can't find out because ethnicity is not being counted in this country. No registration. We don't know. But on the other hand, we know that the aspiration of many young students coming from minority positions is precisely to study law and medicine. So I would advise you to study and see what in the how many of them you will find as law students. The second reason that I hear is their Dutch is not good enough. And for a judge, to become a judge, your knowledge of Dutch should be so refined that it should be above, well, any suspicion. This is hardly a convincing argument to make for successful law students, isn't it? Then there is also the cultural explanation of it. Migrants, in general, do not aspire governmental positions, as they come from countries with authoritarian regimes. These are the enemies. Criminal law students, therefore, that there are, will become defense lawyers and have their own businesses rather than magistrates. In this case, I argue to open up research into these questions and try to convince the judiciary to remedy this serious problem and look in other countries where all sorts of remedies have been tried out. I can talk for at least an hour on this. Now, the next point that I'm going to discuss is, what do we know about delinquency in the multicultural society? Is there really something specific about it? The international research has produced a list of quite unexpected results, and it would be my hypothesis that these results would also be valuable in Flanders. The first fact is that immigration reduces crime. The first generation of immigrants have lower crime rates always than the rest of society. However, in the first generation, there is a qualitative problem. There are the so-called cultural delicts. It doesn't happen very often, but they pose very serious problems how to deal with that. Cultural crimes are behavior that would be normally expected or condoned in immigrant communities, but that is punishable by law in a new country where they have immigrated to. Belgian researchers have been taken part in this discussion. I'm sorry that Professor Fablets is not yet amongst us about this subject, but I have found that there is very, very little cultural sensitivity in the judiciary about this. It's different for the second generation. Usually, when crime rates are high, and my prediction would be that if you are going to count it, the crime rates for Moroccan, more for Moroccan than for Turks, will be higher than average, and that will probably be counted as, will be attributed to a lack of integration. This interpretation in other countries have also shown to be wrong. This is why I have made the difference between structural and cultural integration in the section 1 that I talked about. And groups with low socio-economic integration, few jobs, poor school results, and so on. But high cultural integration, absorption of norms, we see the highest figures. Now, further regularity that we have found, that the early age of boys becoming delinquent, and we are, well, for the countries where this has been counted, we are talking about 10, 20, or 30%. It's really very serious. The early age of boys becoming delinquent points to an inverse relationship between crime and socioeconomic disadvantage. This means growing up in a subculture that fosters delinquency, hinders social success. Think only of the problem of truancy. Then, thirdly, in our theory, I'm talking criminological theory, as you can understand. I'm a criminologist. In our theory, there's the question of the cultural explanation of crime and delinquency. Here, researchers often turn to an unfounded essentialist explanation. Modern criminology teaches us to look for well-proven general risk factors, such as the lack of social control by or parental supervision, and see how these are distributed over the various ethnic groups. There's also the idea now called street culture. This is a bricolage of the youngsters themselves. We have new identities that some juvenile delinquents here in this city, for example, with a Congo background, have made for themselves in Matongé. And this is inspired by American films such as New Jack City. About this, by the way, is a very good PhD dissertation. A very popular theory is about acculturation stress resulting from taking part in various educational environments. One and the same boy, we're practically only talking about boys, but that's in general the problem with crime, of course. They are educated at home, they are educated in school, and on the street. And those influences run counter to each other and may produce cultural dissonance. Now, finally, we have the problem of terrorism. I'm also going to say something about that. After 9/11, we have been overwhelmed in our field of criminology by theories and explanations, especially of terrorism and Muslim communities. I have been teaching this for several years, but the empirical problem has always been that there are so few terrorists. It's hard to find any to study or interview. Any explanation derived from just a few terrorists holds for thousands of people who are similarly situated, but who don't engage into terrorism or even think about it. So the predictive power of most of these books that I've been teaching is very, very low. However, the latest insight is by Olivier Roy, based on the study of 100 cases brought together by good journalists in Western Europe. And his findings are spectacular in two respects. First, there is very little proof of radicalization of communities, and therefore also the idea of supervising a community as such is in danger, or even individuals. And secondly, the choice of Islam seems to be made after a trajectory of ordinary delinquency and personal maladjustment. In Belgian terrorism studies, authors often point out the local level in order, to contain it. Professor Aguirre this morning started also to talk about the fact that many of the immigrant communities identify with the local community rather than with the state or the larger community. Now, if this is true, then community policing or integration of neighborhoods into society at large are expected to do the trick. Two extremes that I have found that are often named in the Belgian writings about this are south of Molenbeek in Brussels and the town of Mechelen, which has a Moroccan community but very little extremism. We have invited two speakers today from those areas to explain this to us. Well, I'm going to end, but not before I make the claim that it should be really time for researchers here in Belgium to start studying these kind of things and not look the other way. I have found an impressive list of objections to this kind of study. Ethnicity and crime cannot be studied in this country. And why? There is a good theoretical reason. The choice of subjects can solely be based upon essentialist reading. It is as if culture or ethnicity directly incite crime. In addition, they say it's erroneous to ascribe relatively high crime rates in certain disadvantaged neighborhoods to minorities that live there. Second objection against studying crime and ethnicity is empirical. The research is redundant. We are told, since earlier studies have already demonstrated that variations in the crime rates of specific ethnic minorities can very well be explained by a combination of socio-economic factors and their selectivity by the conduct of the police and the criminal justice apparatus. So researchers already seem to know what the outcome is. And then there is a social and political objection against studying these things together. Research of this kind can easily encourage stigmatization of certain groups and contribute only to their marginalization. As a matter of fact, even since the 1980s, the populist party Vlaams Belang has been blaming immigrants for high crime rates and other social evils. Registering national descent also goes against Belgian immigration policy. They say immigrants would become Belgium as rapidly as possible, and children of the second and third generation would not appreciate being called just that. Now I'm going to change the perspective, and I'll tell you why I think that you should study it and not be hindered by these objections. So, what are the arguments in favor of it? Well, I go back to the main theoretical idea. The main theoretical objection is that researchers willfully overlook questions relevant to the formulation of the theory of cultural diversity. By rejecting studies in advance, the Belgian research community loses touch with a theme, an important theme in criminology. Theories on the multicultural society cannot be developed without empirical research. To be sure, studies on crime and delinquency are conducted in Belgium, but often focus on social construction of social problems and not on the problems themselves. But of course, they would not accept a difference to be made between the two. Secondly, the empirical sciences can only move forward by constantly testing questions presented by research of others. There is ample knowledge on this theme in other countries, and no researcher can seriously claim, as I just said, to have the final answer. Thirdly, it would seem as if the academic world in Belgium has long been faced with a taboo. Readers will be struck by how passionately the discussion has been conducted. But taboos do not belong in the world of science. The question remains tough whether the wariness of the topic inspires in Belgium really leads to the desired result. Deliberately ignoring an existing problem entails the risk of it becoming politically unmanageable. But the main argument against overlooking research into ethnicity and crime is that racist agitation cannot be refuted with scientific facts if we don't have them. What is more, a dearth of research makes it less politically urgent to take measures to remedy undesirable situations. And this is what I ask my fellow criminologists or fellow social scientists in Flanders to do. Thank you very much.